about the business of Formula One. You know a bit about that, obviously, having written a book called that. But in particular on the cost cap. Can we dig into a little bit on the cost cap and what's happening at the moment?
Well, quite simply, what's happening at the moment is that, as ever, there's a development race between the top teams. And as the teams develop, they spend money. And they're spending more money than they anticipated. Christian Horner's been very clear about that. Toto Wolff and his team have talked about it. Well, even Ferrari, perhaps not surprisingly, Ferrari are also finding it difficult to keep within the restrictions of the cost cap. The cost cap was originally brought in at $145 million on a sliding scale of then $140 million this year and then $135 million next year. And there is a real challenge for the top three teams. And I say the top three teams because for many of the other teams, it's not a question of coming down to that cost cap. They actually wouldn't normally reach it, or they would struggle to get to that level anyway. So it certainly is a factor for every team. But for the top three teams who are used to spending a great deal more than that on the car, on the technical research and development, design, manufacturing, operations, spare parts. It's basically, think of the cost cap as being everything to do with building and racing the cars and operating the racing team. It doesn't include a whole raft of things such as the drivers' salaries, the top three salaries of the top three employees in the team. It doesn't cover marketing. It doesn't cover HR costs. It doesn't cover property costs. There's lots of areas which are not included in the cost cap. So think of the cost cap as very much about the cars and racing and development. And it's proving extremely challenging. We always knew it would. There are some additional factors which are coming into play. Due to the energy price crisis, which here in Europe is very, very significant, we are seeing substantial increases in energy costs. And if you look, for example, at the cost of factory operations, like the single biggest source of carbon emissions from a Formula One factory are the wind tunnels. And that's because they use so much energy to power them. So that if your energy bill is jumping 30, 40, 50% every time you do a wind tunnel run, every time you do some development, or every time you use those supercomputers to run a CFD computation. So again, you're talking about data centers, which are energy hungry. The costs have gone up. So the teams are effectively, the top teams are saying the budget cap is difficult to adhere to. And it'll be interesting to see the reaction of, I don't think they're going to get a lot of sympathy from the smaller teams. I don't think the FIA will be rushing to raise the cap. And I certainly don't think Formula One Group will be rushing to do that either. They will say, well, you have to cut your costs. I have to cut your cloth accordingly. So there's a lot of debate around it. And I mean, we can get further into the detail of it, but all I will say is it's an incredibly robust process that they are going through. Next month, at the 30th of June, all of the teams have to present their financials from the first part of this season. And, so effectively you have an interim cost result. So this is our interim expenditure. And, there are penalties here, and the penalties are really quite significant if you start to overstep the mark. So, we're essentially operating in a whole new world in Formula One where you have sporting regulations, you have technical regulations, and you have financial regulations. And to breach those financial regulations would be as serious as turning up with an underweight car or, breaching a sporting regulation.
And no sympathy from the top teams, Alex. Before you, I want to get off because our viewers, do they have any sympathy for this? As we keep on this conversation, do tweet us or other social media at GoF1 Show. Alex, have you got any sympathy for the big teams?
No, none whatsoever. I mean, there was such a big regulation. I got lots of sympathy for small teams. I've always raced with the small teams. But, with such a big regulation change, like we had this year, normally we see the big teams just run away with it. It's a big gap between the big teams and the small teams. We haven't seen it this year. We've actually seen the teams be pretty close together. We've even seen teams like Haas and Alfa Romeo be strong and mix it with the big boys, especially earlier on in the beginning of the season. And that's because of these, not necessarily because of the cost cap, because that hasn't actually had an effect yet, but these equalizing factors that should come into sport. The fact that they're limiting wind tunnel time for the bigger teams because they won the championship, and you get more wind tunnel time for the smaller teams, which is a way of offsetting the fact that the bigger teams will always find more sponsorship, and whereas the smaller teams will never be able to find that sort of sponsorship. So all these things are good because it makes the gaps between the teams smaller, it makes it fairer, and that's what sport should be.
Isn't there a danger, Mark, that the bigger teams would have to lay off staff if they don't want to either turn off those wind tunnels and computers that you've mentioned, or obviously more seriously, is there a danger of people losing their jobs?
Yeah, well, that's already happened, and we've seen Ferrari redeploy staff. I know that teams, for example, when people leave the company, they are more likely to redeploy existing staff than to employ new people. I talked to Mercedes-Benz when I was studying this last year, and they admitted, I think the number they gave me was 50 to 60 employees have gone completely out of the operation. Now, you have to bear in mind that's a big operation, including the powertrain division. It's like nearly 1,800 people. So 50 out of 1,800 is not exactly a massive cut. And again, you would lose that in a year in terms of people just moving on, going to get other jobs, or retiring out of your business. So the numbers are less. However, what we're talking about, I think, really is a kind of an interesting, it's a kind of deeply philosophical debate about what should a team be allowed to do to be competitive in Formula One. Clearly, the top teams are used to being able to spend and develop their car and iterate the car race to race, month to month, bringing those upgrades that we're always talking about. Those upgrades are expensive. And the simple fact is that, with the pace of development that they are used to, they're trying to adjust that curve. Alex has pointed out that some of the smaller teams have kind of been showing well because dollar for dollar, the smaller teams are more used to spending their money carefully. But I'll tell you one really interesting thing that I discovered last year was I spoke to Enrico Racca. Now, Enrico Racca is not a name that you would know very well in F1 circles, but he is the guy at Ferrari responsible for Ferrari making the budget cap. And I spoke to Enrico because he's dealing with the team that has traditionally had the biggest budget, and I was expecting him to really moan at me and say it's a complete nightmare and we're having a terrible time. And he actually said we're really relishing it at Ferrari. He said we think it's great that you can now focus on making sure that every dollar you spend does something useful, and therefore it drives wastage out of our Formula One business. And he said actually our car business is looking very carefully at what we're learning from the budget cap in Formula One, because if we can develop competitive cars in Formula One in a much more cost-effective way than we used to, then he said that's actually really good for our business, and of course it improves our profitability, etc. So he took a very positive view of it, and he said, it's challenging, but he said it's not impossible. And the other thing is everyone has signed up for it, so it's not as if it's picking on any one team. Everyone simply has to deliver. But I do completely think that as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there has been a commodity price increase globally. There's obviously an energy crisis. There are all kinds of additional costs coming through which were unforeseen. It is quite unprecedented what's happening. And of course, from a purely European perspective, all the Formula One teams are based in Europe. And they are therefore seeing very directly the increase in costs. And just for those listeners and viewers in other parts of the world, if I was to give you a kind of a measure, families, for example, in the United Kingdom are seeing their household energy bills in many cases tripling. I mean, it's actually, that depends on who your energy provider is. That's substantial. So that the government in the UK has just announced that each family will now have a budget cap of about $4,000 US, and that's just for your energy, and that's for every family. Okay. And as you can imagine, not every family in the UK can afford a $4,000 energy bill. So that's a kind of very micro way of looking at they're just trying to cook food and keep the lights on and the heating and so on. So you blow that up into the kind of budgets that we're talking about for Formula One. It's a very significant challenge, and I'm sure that there will be a discussion about the implications of this. What I could see happening is perhaps the FIA and Formula One agreeing that on certain things that you spend money on, such as energy, you are perhaps given an opportunity to have a specific overspend in certain areas. But if it comes down to more wind tunnel tests, more CFD, I don't think there'll be no sympathy for that.
Well, I think what they should do is they should stop having VIPs and celebrities on the grid, and they should sell those passes to sponsors and then put that money into the smaller teams.